They asked me to give a talk about the cerebellum. Some people have probably heard me before about the cerebellum, so it's not going to be new. So, and it's free. You can ask questions every time you want. What about the cerebellum? And I collected few items from last year's about what the cerebellum is doing. And the first paper is published in 2010, and it's called Life Without the Cerebellum. And it's talking about this guy, Boyd, is really talking about his father, that was also a neuroscientist. And he studied the nervous system in London. And the idea is there is a patient named H.C. who died at the age of 76, and in 1940 to die at the age of 76 is not a simple thing. And yet, they didn't find any cerebellum after his death. They dissect, there's not cerebellum. And that's what he claimed led to the oral tradition and the myth that people who are born without cerebellum may have no observable symptom at all, because we didn't know anything about this guy. He lived until the age of 76. Not cerebellum, but nothing. And you need to see a picture. There is no cerebellum, normal life. So, yes, you know, it's many, many million of cells, and you lose them and nothing. Maybe the older cerebellum, all the brain is nonsense. C. elegans will do the same with 900 cells, so why do you need all the brain? So he described another patient from more recent time where we could see something about the behavior of the patient. She showed polydextrity, surprising, disrupt predictive control of object grasp. You know what's that? You know how much force we apply. She also saw evidence of straightening conditioning eye blink, and showed mild to moderate neurophysiological impairment in IQ, planning behavior, visual, verbal. That's all words. Basically, the patient lives without cerebellum. He doesn't need the cerebellum. And then, when he finished the paper, this paper, he said, should we perhaps be measuring the capacities of these rare patients against those brilliant, gifted, and well-paid musicians and athletes who might be said to have more fully exploited the wonderful skill of the cerebellum that their cerebellum can support? But what about the rest of us who live in an increasingly sedentary life, where much of the requirement for motor skill has been replaced by electronic whistling? So he claims evolution became the cerebellum, basically. We don't need it anymore. I'll go in one more paper that published in 2014, and here we already have an MRI study, and you can see there's a big hole here. There's no cerebellum at all. But she didn't begin to walk unassisted until age 7 with a precision unsteady gait. She never went to jog. Her speech was not intelligible until 6 years of age, and she didn't enter school. Big deal. We don't need the cerebellum to go to school, right? It's not a requirement. From here, I want to go to another story, cerebellum evolution. And cerebellum is another paper from 2014. And they claim, what they use a statistical method to study evolution. And using methods for detecting evolutionary rate change along the branches of polygenetic tree, we showed that the cerebellum underwent rapid size increase throughout the evolution of apes, including humans, expanding significantly faster than predicted by the change in the neocortex. So he was to say that our amazing brain, the recent evolution in the brain is within the cerebellum. This result suggests that cerebellar specialization was far more important of human brain evolution than previously recognized. So you can see that there is a mixture of idea. On the one side you have real example of people without the cerebellum, and they live. I don't know, they're happy, they are intelligent, I don't know if they can run the marathon, but they do live. And one of the people have get married and total missing of the cerebellum. Okay, I'll skip this one of the elephant brain, which is also interesting. And I will start to talk about the cerebellum, and I don't know how much Matthew told you about the cerebellum, so I briefly remind you structural organization of the cerebellum, and then I'll go into what I am interested in. So the cerebellar cortex, you know, the main component of the cerebellar cortex is either Purkinje. Purkinje is the unique cell, it's extremely the most beautiful cell in the nervous system. It's a 2D cell, it's totally planary. The distance between this dendritic tree is about 200 to 300 microns, while if you look at it from the side, it's about 5 microns. And then the question, why do you need such a huge cell? It's also a very important question. And the idea is that you can sample a huge number of inputs that are going through this immense dendritic tree. And then it's true that in a minute you'll see the major input to the cerebellum is the climbing fiber. The climbing fiber, by the name, they climb around the dendritic tree, generating a huge synapse. A synapse that is the strongest synapse in the nervous system, but there's only one cell, one fiber per Purkinje cell. Each Purkinje cell is innervated by a single climbing fiber. And this is a mystery. It's very unusual when we're looking on organization of the brain. One single fiber for Purkinje. So this is one input. The other input are the mossy fiber, and the mossy fiber go into the granular cell, and the granular cell consists of most of the neurons in the cerebellum are granular cells. Billion and billion of cells are granular cells, tiny little cells that have one axon going from the molecular layer up to the from the granular layer up to the molecular layer, where the axon is bifurcating, and all these billion of cells generate massive number of fibers. The parallel fiber, you can see the dot here, and those parallel fiber innervating the Purkinje cell. So each Purkinje cell sample something like 200,000, 100,000 parallel fibers. So this is very simple. 2 excitatory input, one output. The Purkinje cell axon is the only output of the cerebellar cortex, and it's inhibitory. This is also a problem. How can you deliver information by inhibitory signal? In addition to that, we have the Golgi cell, which is the local inhibitory interneuron, which is very unique also in having all these little dark things are the axon bifurcation of this Golgi cell is innervating the massive layer of the granular cell. And in addition, we have several inhibitory interneurons within the molecular layer. The molecular layer is the top layer, and within the granular layer also. And there we have this thing. And this, the amazing thing about cerebral, in my opinion, it is totally preserved through evolution. And if you study a biological item, in my opinion, you have to look on the evolutionary pressure or evolutionary process. We can learn more from evolution than from measuring single cell activity. So in the cerebellum, it's well preserved. So if you look at the cerebellum of amphibian or frog, you can say the cerebellum is a tiny little thing right here. And here enlarged here. And within this thing, you see exactly the same organization. Purkinje cell, 2D Purkinje cell, huge number of parallel fiber, climbing fiber coming in, exactly the same. And you move on in the evolution to reptiles, and you look at the alligator cerebellum. It's a little bit larger, but within that, you have the parallel fiber running, the Purkinje cell, and the climbing fiber and the granular cells, exactly the same. Again, to the birds, and you can see that the cerebellum in a bird is rather large. If this is the entire brain, the cerebellum is as large as the brain of the bird. And the idea is that the birds have to behave in 3D, and we have to behave in 2D. To behave in 3D in space, you have to have a larger cerebellum because it's controlled mostly your motor performance. And finally, in mammals, cerebellum is huge, but it's the same. And the question is, why it has been preserved? And in evolution, it really cannot answer the question why. You cannot do experiments. You need billions of years in order to do experiments. And we don't have these billions of years. But the idea is that we develop a system through evolution. And it turned to be extremely useful, extremely accurate. Then the system can take this that's already been built and implement it in different functions. And therefore, the idea is that we start with a cerebellum that controls motor activity, and we end up with cerebellum that participate almost in everything. And that means that the circuit is in the cerebellum is capable of doing one thing. And then it can be implemented in different functions. And not this single thing is the thing I'm looking for. And I hope I'll convince you by the end of the lesson. Now I want to introduce another important circuitry within the cerebellum. The circuitry called the cerebellar module. And the people believe that this is the basic unit that performs whatever the cerebellum is performing. And this basic unit is composed of the Purkinje cell that I mentioned before, the cerebellar nuclei cell is the main output of the cerebellum. Purkinje cell innervating the cerebellar nuclei, and the inferior olive, which provide the climbing fiber to the Purkinje cell. So the inferior olive innervate the Purkinje cell in one-to-one manner. Purkinje cell go down to the cerebellar nuclei, and they activate the cerebellar nuclei is composed of several types of neurons, of which one group of inhibitory interneurons that go back to the inferior olive and inhibit the inferior olive. And this kind of loop, where you have excitatory state from here to there, inhibitory from here to here, and another inhibitory from here to there, is a very unique, and its repeat itself is well organized within the cerebellum, and the other neuron here are in fact the cerebellar output. So if anyone in our brain know what happened in the cerebellum, is through this output. The closed system sends a single output. For years, people thought that this is a kind of a relay station, and it doesn't do much. But if you study the physiology by now, you know that they thought about relay station for everything. The thalamus was a relay station. All the nuclei are relay station. But the meaning of relay station, it's meaningless. Yeah, go on.
Can you record that?
Sure. You didn't activate? Are you?
Yeah.
No, are you recording?
What shall I do?
Just where the
You told me to open this thing. I opened it.
Just turn the sound and put it on the side.
You wanted to talk to the...
The microphone.
Okay. How did I get here? Get back to the beginning. It's not a really, in recent study we show that it's not a really relay station. It makes some computation. So you have basic knowledge on morphology, you have basic knowledge on physiology, and we want to go ahead.
What do you mean by a relay station? What do you mean by a relay station?
Relay station, it's a term coined to describe a place in the brain that doesn't do computation. It just transmits information from one place to another. We may integrate some information, but basically it's a relay station. And people want to know how the brain is working. Relay station is not interesting. Okay, so what is the cerebellar function? Cerebellar function is, let's say we are a student, and we want to see what's the cerebellar function. We go to the internet, and we punch down cerebellum and function. And you got out thousands of paper. So I put some of this work for you, and you can find a lot of paper about cerebellum and motor capability. That is not surprising. It's an old idea. It still holds that the cerebellum is deeply involved in motor activity. Then you can find a group of papers that are talking about sensory integration or affecting sensory perception by the cerebellum. And then you go on and you found a group of papers that say it's something to do with cognition, nothing to do with motor. It's high brain function in the cerebellum. Autism in cerebellum is recent, very hot item. Everyone wants to see how the cerebellum is changed with autistic people. Dyslexia is also cerebellum. Cognition, behavior, everything. So what do? You have two options. If you are in the field of cerebellar research, you start to cry. Because we studied this structure for 200 years. We still didn't figure out what it's doing. If you are outside of the field, you burst laughing. These people studied the cerebellum for 200 years. They still don't know what it's doing. The problem is it doesn't matter. If you laugh and cry, you also link to the cerebellum. And pathological laughter and crying is a real symptom. And they found a link to the cerebellum. So you think, okay, that's funny, good humor. And you go on, humor comprehension. You found left cerebellum. Can't get out of it.
What is pathological laughter?
You don't know these people that cry when you tell them a joke? No? There are people that you tell them a joke, they start to cry. And you tell them a very sad story, they start to laugh. This is called pathological crying and laughing. There are people who suffer from that. can imagine that they have big problem in society, very low. Okay, so what to do with the cerebellum? So I got to present 3 lines of research and emphasizing one thing that I think is common to all cerebellar function. And the first work is work by Timan in the late 90s, and they do a very simple experiment that gave people a ball to throw on a target. So they have to throw the ball and hit the target. And what you see here is the point of the ball hitting the target. So these are controlled, look like professional ball throwing because they're making over and over and over again exactly the same. And these are cerebellar patients. And we look at the cerebellar patient, and you got the notion that you have a lot of distribution along the y-axis, a little bit smaller along the x-axis. So cerebellar patients have problem in getting to the target, and the question is why. So for those of you that have been in the army and have been in the Shurion, how do you say Shurion in English? Armor. So you know that you have to hit the target with the cannon of the tank. You have problem in elevation. And that seems that they have problem in elevation. They don't know how to set it. So what she did is to try to follow the trajectory of the end of the ball throwing. So you look at the location of the end while throwing the ball, and what you see, you don't see. What you see is this is a sample of the trajectory of the hand while we're throwing the ball. And you can see the repetition is very similar with the cerebellar patient. It's also very similar, but a little bit wider variation between identical. Also here in this patient, it looks very much the same. So it does seem to have a problem with design the trajectory. So what's the problem? Why it doesn't hit? And what you see is the little dot at the end of the trajectory. This little dot mark the point when you open your finger and you let the ball go. Because when you throw the ball, you hold it in your hand, you do the trajectory, and then you, at a certain time, you open the finger. And what you see is, take this patient. He has a similar trajectory, but once you open the finger here, and once you open the finger here. If you open the finger there, you're going to hit high. If you open the fingers here and let the ball go, it's going to hit low. So that what's missing in this patient, at least from this example, is the exact time of open the finger and let the ball go. So time seems to be something in common to all these people that suffer from cerebral problem. You don't really know when to do the things. And of course, if you have problem with timing, your movement might be disrupted. Your reading skill will be disrupted because your eyes have to go through the words in a kind of timed fashion. And if you have problem with that, problem with time is not only for motor performance, because as you saw before, there are some cognitive aspects for the cerebellum, and this is usually related to the fact that when we behave, we have to coordinate our attention. So we want to see, or we want to hear, or you want to feel. This is a matter of coordinating our attention. And if you think deeply, what's the difference between coordinating muscle and coordinating attention? It's all about time. You have to shift from one to another. You have to coordinate finger tapping. It's the same thing. Maybe time scale a little bit different, but the mechanism that will determine exact time is common. We need something to tell us when to do what. And those people also, with the attention, claim that this is basically the problem with autism. Because if you cannot coordinate your attention, think about it, you cannot coordinate your attention, you are bombarded with information, visual, sensory, auditory, all the time, and that can drive crazy anyone. So the people who claim that cerebellum is a major player in autism claim that the basic is timing of attention shift. Now I go to another experiment that, yeah.
But how do you know that there isn't one mechanism for timing
You know what?
movement?
How do I know that?
That there isn't one mechanism for timing movement and one
I
different
don't know.
mechanism
I
for
don't know.
timing.
But if you remember the 2 slides before, problem with the cerebellum is common to motor and cognitive. I mean, I saw some papers say the missing cerebellum have cognitive deficits. Missing cerebellum have motor. So I don't have to hypothesize one timing mechanism for cognition and one timing mechanism for motor. We don't have enough space in our brain to too many mechanisms.
But isn't it difficult to separate the motor and the cognitive
Why? Why?
because you can't know...
Cerebellum is huge. You saw 10 to the 9 cells. You cannot dedicate one part for cognition and another part for motor. The mechanism of generating time is very much the same. It's not sharing the same space in the cerebellum. Is that clear?
Why would they share the cerebellum at all? Why would they both be in the cerebellum?
Because we have evolution developed a beautiful circuitry to generate time. So you use it for motor. After 10 billion years, you can use it for cognition. Same circuit. You don't have to invent something new. And saving is a key pressure in evolution.
I see the simplicity, but it doesn't mean that that's what...
Well, what?
I see that it's more harmonious to have them both in the cerebellum, but it doesn't mean that that's what...
We will see in a minute. It's not just like that. Ken?
Is it shown that, talking about autism, that people with autism have some dysfunction, all of them, in the cerebellum?
I have a problem with the definition of autism, and it's cover everything. You know, autism spectrum disorder is a huge spectrum, and one thing is different from the other thing, and there's many things that can cause it. And this day, the genetic study of autism shows that certain mutation really can end up with autism, but very small population of the neuron. And if you talk about clinical aspect, the number of people identified as autistic going up, huge. Not because they will have more autism because of pollution, just because they changed the criteria for identification. It's the same people. It's not because Trump didn't sign the agreement that we'll have more autistic people here. So the second example for function of the cerebellum that I like very much is the question: why can't we tickle ourselves? Think about that. It would be extremely beautiful if we could tickle ourselves. We cannot. It's not the same. Everyone knows that. So these people did a beautiful study. Why we cannot tickle ourselves? How they do? They invented this machine. And this machine is made of 2 points, right? And elevated thing here, but it's not important. You're tickling the palm of the subject. And you can do it by yourself, that's self-tickling, or the guy outside is moving this thing. The stimulus will be exactly the same. Either you do it or the other guy is doing it. The sensation, the way that the skin responds to the stimulus is exactly the same. And then they had another option that they remove the tickling and then the guy itself can make the movement, so we can distinguish between the movement itself and the response. And they took these people and put them in the fMRI machine. And they measure. And they measure the change in activity on these 4 categories. Rest, nothing. This is the somatosensory cortex. Externally produced tactile stimuli. You have huge response. And that's why we feel tickling, because of this sensory response. Now they went to the cerebellum. No. Self-produced tickling doesn't do anything to the somatosensory cortex. So it's not a big discovery. We know that if somebody tickling us or we tickle ourselves is not the same. That's what it's shown here. But then they went to the cerebellum, and they see that you have a huge response to the self-tickling procedure. And the idea of the authors is that this self-producing tickling going right into the information, go right into the somatosensory cortex and depress any possible input. So we don't feel if we tickle ourselves. And this is due to this response of the cerebellum. This put it in a larger context. You can think of the cerebellum as something that predicts the outcome of our movement. And I strongly hold the idea. I try to say I don't believe. Believe is not a word that should be used in science. I prefer to say I'm holding the idea rather than I believe that. Believe is not a word for science. I hold the idea that the entire brain evolved to make prediction. It doesn't need the brain to movement. You need the brain. The evolutionary pressure beyond brain development is prediction. Because when you have to predict the outcome of your movement, then you need very good computational source. Because you take the information that delivered to the motor system and you have to translate it into expected sensory input. And that's the major reason to evolve a brain. Because for movement, you don't need a brain. Right? All the flower that catch flies, they make beautiful, synchronized movement. Believe me, they don't have brain. So you don't need the brain for movement. You need the brain to prediction. The last thing, that this is also related to time, because you have to do in a certain time to expect the stimulus and so on and so forth. The last thing is that I want to show you a recent paper that it's not only motor. People ask here why we need different, why can't we have another center for cognitive function or so on. So they did this work, this thing in oral substrate for duration-based and B-space auditory timing. And this is a very simple experiment, and you ask the subjects to tell you what's the time between stimuli. And you can do that by a random or jittery input, and then a certain time you have, the subject have to tell you about a certain duration. This is a duration-based discrimination task. And the other one is that you have very clear input duration interval, and then the last one you move or shorten, and then you have to look at it. And these people found a significant activation in the olivocerebellar network comprising the inferior olive, vermis, and deep cerebellar nuclei, including the dentate nuclei, during absolute duration-based timing. Absolute duration-based time, it means that you don't need a background information, you absolutely measure the time. And they do fMRI, and you can see this is cerebellum, and this is the olive, and the olive is strongly activating during this task. And they end up the paper, the inferior olive and the cerebellum act as precision clock to mediate absolute duration-based timing. Relative duration-based estimation of time with the same study they found in the basal ganglia, and they claim the cerebellum involved in absolute time and the basal ganglia in relative time. So we did the inferior olive to cerebellum act as a clock. So we have to look for a clock. Go ahead.
Back to the tickling, was it shown that patients with cerebellar damage were able to tickle themselves?
If people with cerebellar, I don't think that's right. That's interesting. Then it's worth to be cerebellum, right? You can tickle yourself, come on. Or it can be better than you can tickle yourself. So we need a clock, a time. What do you need for a clock? We need a clock within the olive as they suggested. What do you need for a clock? For a clock you need a pendulum. Without a pendulum, there's no clock, something that will determine time. So we look for the inferior olive, and you measure from a neuron in the inferior olive, or this example, 2 neurons in this inferior olive. And you see a sine wave-like change in the memory potential. This is a perfect pendulum. That can determine time. And that's what we want to do, to determine time. And this, you can see that the two cells are the clock work in these two cells exactly the same. Now we want to know what's the stability of a clock, because if a clock is unstable, it's a cheap clock, and you don't buy cheap clock. You have to have accurate clock. So we look at this activity of the memory potential. Over looking on the autocorrelation function of this, as expected, you get a beautiful sine wave in the autocorrelation. And you look on the change in frequency over time. So here is the frequency. This is 2 minutes of recording, and you see beautiful, precise frequency. The cells there maintain a beautiful clock. What about the synchronicity of the clock? Because if every neuron in the inferior olive will make his own game, play his own game, we'll end up with a mess. We need some synchronicity. So we look on two cells that oscillate, like I showed you before. Look at the cross-correlation function of these two things. Perfect. You got it. accurately to the millisecond. But there is a problem. The temporal resolution is a problem, because if these waves are the clock, the pendulum, in order to get accurate measure of time, or accurate, or producing a timed signal, you want a break? Mati, they do have a break? It's a good time, even if it's in the middle of the sentence. It's a quarter to, no, right?
We have
There is 2 more minutes.
You have what?
now it's 40.
We have 2 more minutes.
Come on, who wants to continue? One. Who wants a break? Who doesn't care? Still some people. You will decide. Let's have a break.
גם בעניין חכמיות, אבל קורה יש לי מעניין אותו באופן כללי.
מה? אפשר לדבר?
לא בכל אחד. נבקש מהם גם שיציעו אותנו בשאלות, אבל בסוף השאלות אחרי זה נענה עליהם יותר. לא, שתי אמרתי 5.
אני כן הולך עוד הוא היה שתיות, מה זה רוב היה?
יפה. האמת שראיתי אותו.
כן? גם גדול?
האמת שגם אני בשיר חושב כבר צריך להיות טוב. יש שם שינוי לפעמים די שבע נגיד. מה שלא יש, שבע,
אמר, שבע?
5.5 קבענו?
להגיד לך.
לא, חצי קיבלת מסך. לא חצי אפילו מתאר המקרה, מתאר המקרה להשאיר.
שמונה הקטנה?
מי אתה הולך? ראית כבר הגנתי קראתי לפסיכולוגיה חדש?
לא ראית ראשון.
אני כבר ממש לא
בחורף יש הבדל שאנחנו...
אמרנו 5.5, מקום מעודכן בהמשך. עכשיו סתם נותנת להיות בין חצי שעה ל-20 דקות, קצת שאלות, קצת ביקורת.
לא, חכה. אני רואה אותה עם הסוכר. תקשיב לכולם. ולכולם סתם, כן? היא פרקה נראה לי מתוך התקנה הזאת ככה גודל של זה. וטעם. כל הדברים ממש גדולים, אבל כמו שוקולד.
גם בהר של עצמוי. כן, גם עשינו איזה...
גם עשינו איזה פיסנדל.
ויש לה גם
בסדר, הם מבטאים את הכל. מבטאים ממקום למקום.
שיש לה מישהו אחד שידע לתפוס כן, ראיתי את ה... מה זה היה? 13 עמודים? מה שלנו? שלנו. 52.
לא. הוא לא פשוט מה שהוא העלה, הוא לא כתוב כאילו בצורה מסודרת כמו במאמר עצמו. המאמר עצמו כשהוא פורסם, אז הוא איזה לא יודעת מה.
כן.
אבל כשהוא מסודר בשורות כזה בצורה לא מסודרת כמו לפני שעבר אז זה 60 עמודים משהו על זה.
מי מדבר ראשון נכון?
לא משנה.
אוקיי, לא משנה.
זה רק אנחנו.
זה גם מדבר אחריו.
לדעתי זה גם לא.
הוא נותן חדשה וכל אחד נותן.
מה עכשיו אנחנו נתומד? או איפה אני נתומד?
גם הם לא מתאים לפניו. ומה בדיוק?
היו איזושהי חרדים על קצת לפני שרצו כל התמודד. רציתי לומר זה להתחייב מזה
שהם הצליחו לעשות את המודל.
ואז רצו לשחק
ואז הם עשו מה...
זה שעשו ספייסים קטנים והראו שיש פיזר טבעי ולא מאוזן או משהו? לא, זה מאמר אחר שאני מציג גרף ממנו.
לא, זה לא יודע, היה חי על
שני אזורים.
ניתוחים כמובן אוכלוסייה שפוגעים
זה צריך להגיד ליופי
זה לא אקספרימנטים שאתה רואה?
זה לא עבד.
מה חגה את ה...
הגן הזה דווקא בגלל הרבה פשוט
שאלה? כמה אתם עושים את זה?
בהתחלה. לא, חיפשתי האמת סרטון שמראה מישהו סרטון אבל לא זה היה די מטריד. זה שעושה את זה בסרטון.
למה?
לא יודע, כל מיני דברים מזמנים.
כמה זמן לפני שאני אהיה לי איזשהו הערכה? לא, הסרטון.
ואז חלקית על איך האינטראקציה שהם נספו לעשות
אולי זה כאילו שרואה סרטון ואנחנו לא נעשה. כן.
כן, אנחנו גם לא חופפים יותר לתכנון לתכנון כנראה.
אנחנו גם חושבים שיש מודל אחר, אבל אנחנו מדברים על משהו אחר.
נכון, זה, אני ממש רציתי את המאמר.
כן?
טוב, באמת, אחלה.
נשמע ממש מעניין.
הוא גם ממש מעניין וגם אפשר לעשות הרבה חופש ומעניין.
גם הוא קצר, כאילו גם הוא הנושא שלו קצר, אפשר להרכיב עבור 2006 של אנשים שהיו פה. נתנאל ארקדי, דוד.
מה תשאל אם אנחנו במאמר של
כנראה אנחנו במאמר של
עוזי?
ארקדי זה השם משפחה. ויש את יעל ניב.
דודי, כן, דודי.
יעל ניב, גם אחת הייתה.
נראה עבדו אצלו.
כן.
אני גם. שמתי את זה במצגת.
כי ישבנו חגי או לא שמנו
לא, אני חשבת.
לא, כן, שאלתי אותו למשל שככה הוא לומד.
טוב, נגיד, הייתי בזה.
אין לי ברירה, יש כל הזמן אפשרויות. בכיוון של לעשות לא, זה לא יהיה סיסטמים. אני אגיד לך, במסגר ממש לא קריטי, כי לא שאני משנה, אבל אני קשה לי. כאילו לי, אז אני צריך את הרפס. ווואו.
שוב, גם עכשיו תפסיק תהיה לי לא נעים.
בסמינר, שאלתי בסמינר מציגים באנגלית, שאלתי רק לכל יותר שלה, תוקע לי עוד איזה מילה באמצע, עוד איזה מילה באמצע, ואני כאילו...
זה נורא.
לסיים.
משפט.
זהו, זה כאילו, זה באנגלית, אתה צריך לחשוב על כל מילה שאתה מנסים להרצה.
באנגלית יש לי כבר את כל השטיקים האלה של דברים שאני אומר בזמן שאני חושב.
זהו, זה... אולי מתי שאנגלית יהפך להיות סטיקים. תשמע, כשאני רוצה לדעת מוצאת ככה שמתאגת לדבר שבוע באנגלית, אני חולמת באנגלית.
וואו, נייס.
באנגלית, כן. כי אני פתאום קולטת את עצמי מדברת לעצמי. אני כאילו אומרת לעצמי דברים ועולות לי מילים באנגלית, ואז דוברת.
קרה לי כאילו כשלמדתי את מבחן אמירה, אז כאילו הייתי מכניס במשפטים, כשאני מדבר עם אנשים מילים באנגלית, וכזה. אני מכיר את המילה הזאת,
כן, כן.
זה בכלל קורה, אנשים שלא קשורים לתואר, אתה מוצאים סוף מהם מילים כמו אנביטיביות וזה.
כן, האמת שגם עכשיו בסמינר, שלכל מיני מילים שיש מילים שלא הצלחתי לפרש בעברית, דיברתי עם אנשים, לא ידעתי איך להגיד בהם
זה גם, זה קורה גם לי. אז כשבמילים ממש מקצועיות, אני לומד בספר מקצועי, אני לומד, או פה שאני לומד מילים מקצועיות באנגלית, או כשאני קורא נגיד, ואת חישוביות אני לומד מהספר. אז זה באנגלית. וואו, מדהים. כאילו, אתה לא יכול לא להבין שאתה אומר. כאילו, מסביר לך איזה, זה לא רק מצד אחד, מצד שני ספר, הסתרה שלך, סבבה, ברגע לא.
אני לא טעים?
World War III. That's what happens to them.
Kind of.
If you take a stick and you need to do everything you want.
כאילו זה
You
רק
need at least 9 hours a day.
But it's not 9 hours like when you study from 8 p.m. and you wake up at 5 in the morning. No.
If I wake up, if I go to sleep at 8 p.m. tonight, I don't do it. I go to sleep at 12 1 a.m.
I don't know the hours. I mean, my clock barely rings 5, 6 or 7. There's no time in the watch.
What time do you wake up?
וואו.
When you get to this,
את ה...
3 p.m. and it's completely dark. It's horrible. It's wonderful for weekends, but in normal days that I have to do stuff,
But it,
I have to leave it a little bit open.
there's no way that this time will properly.
No?
I don't keep the thin and I don't keep the.
But how do you, like the problem is if I don't put the trees down, everybody can see it.
Okay.
I don't. They don't care. I care. You love you. If it's the you, it's your boyfriend. You should. Okay. Sweating style or style.
No. Pachman go from Bruni. Pachman.
Oh, I didn't know those words.
Pachman is carbon. Kaptan is oxygen. Why you like to put it down? To make it understand. נראה לי שמתחילה. עמידות? לא, ברור.
טוב, אני מקווה שכנעתי אתכם שיש איזה עניין של שעון בתוך הגרעין הזה של האינפיריור אוליב. I hope I convinced you that there is something about clock in the nucleus of an inferior olive, and we start to look on the properties of this clock. And the next hour, I will try to give some more information about the properties of the clock, and then how to integrate it into a kind of a timing machine. So we talked about the stability of the clock, and the problem with the sine wave of constant frequency is the temporal resolution. Because if you have this thing, and within the clock we have all the wheels to reduce or increase the resolution, here we have only sine wave of constant frequency. So I think that we can resolve this problem, because at about 5 hertz of sine wave, the resolution is going to be 200 milliseconds, the temporal resolution. And we need much better resolution when we want to really get the full accurate timing of our system. So we found out that occasionally when you measure from two neurons, they are not precisely in phase. And you have a phase difference. And this phase difference provides you with extra accuracy of the clock, because then you can activate two neurons at a precise different timing of less than 200 milliseconds. So we can improve the temporal resolution by generating phase difference between the activity of the neurons. And sometimes it's really a very strong feature, and you can see two examples of two neurons, and the cross correlation still show accurately synchronized activity. But if you look carefully of the phase, and you'll find out that in this example, the stability of the phase, this is the phase difference, and this is time. In this example, you see the red dots here. You have a negative phase, which is quite constant throughout the 2 minutes of recording. When they are synchronized, it's very constant. And in this example, what you see, the phase look like that within cycle. And you look only on this thing in a large scale, you can see that the phase difference in this example between two neurons can go down to the millisecond range. So we can overcome the problem of slow pendulum with generating several pendulum with phase difference between them. Now, a clock is very nice, but we want to be able to turn it on. It's more like a stopwatch. We want to start the activity now. We want to move. We want to play the piano now and generate the time from now at a given time. So we need a mechanism for resetting the clock. So we studied this problem using optogenetic approach, and I hope you have heard about optogenetic approach, where you can turn on specific circuits by turn on the light, because the neurons there are endowed with a specific channel called channel rhodopsin. So we have this type of mouse that luckily the green thing shows that these are channel rhodopsin location. The dark say that it's devoid of channel rhodopsin, and you can see that the inferior olive in this type of mouse doesn't have any expression of channel rhodopsin. And while the input into the nucleus is all green. So by light we can activate only one type of input into the inferior olive, and we want to use this input to see if we can reset the clock. So when you turn on the light for a couple of milliseconds, you get this kind of synaptic response, meaning that you measure from the inferior olive a excitatory response to light. And if you apply a strong enough light, you can generate an action potential in the neuron. So this is a kind of excitatory input. Now we want to know how this excitatory input is doing to the clock. So these are the oscillating cells, and these are three superimposed traces for a stimulus giving or light stimulus giving at this time. And it's very clear that after the light, it doesn't matter when the light was given, the clock is restarting. You have a mechanism to restart the clock. The fact that after the light they all overlap, it means that we restart the clock.
Was it all measured simultaneously,
Or what?
was it measured simultaneously, or?
No, you have it. You turn on. You measure from a cell. All my record, you measure from the cell. If you don't measure, you don't see response. So you have to measure from the cell, and then you turn on the light, and you see what the light is doing to the oscillatory activity.
I have a question. If we're saying that this is like a clock that predicts what you're going to do in the cerebellum, but there's people who have been born without the cerebellum.
And they have problems.
With
Yeah, they live at
They
LSS.
have problems with the timing of.
Oh, they have. I don't know what kind of problem they have, but they do have problem. I think that, generally speaking, the brain is amazing plastic system. So if you're born with missing part, the system will reorganize to make the best it can. So the fact that you can have it without cerebellum doesn't mean anything. We have studied also regarding this place some mutant. We knock out a certain molecule, kind of disease simulation. You knock out the certain molecule, and then you see that the system is reorganized to generate the same type of activity without this specific molecule. And it does it by upregulation, downregulation of other channel activity. So when you knock out a thing, a molecule, you don't study what this molecule is doing. You study how the system is reorganized without this molecule. The same goes for the cerebellum. If it's not there from birth, the system will reorganize. You'll do it best. It's not perfect solution, but it will reorganize. This is the most amazing feature of the brain. It's plastic. It's all there changing up to a certain age. So we want to quantify it again. Go ahead.
When you use optogenetics, you stimulate many cells at once, right?
Yeah.
So if all cells are doing this stimulation,
all the cell at once, but only one type of cell. I'm stimulating one type of input. One type of input, not one axon. One type of input.
Which cell type? Which channel was it?
What?
Which cell type it was?
It's an excitatory input, only if the source is still debated. Okay, so we want to quantify this thing. We want to quantify this thing, and we measure the time of stimulus as a function of the previous peak. We average the period, and we measure the time to the next peak. And when you do that, when you have absolute resetting, you're going to have this time of response. Because it doesn't matter where in the wave or the cycle you are stimulating, you always restart the system. If you don't have any effect, that's what you're going to get, because it doesn't matter where you put it, the oscillation will continue, and the next peak will be always at the same place. So when you do that, and now you have a tool to measure it, we go back to the system. And with the light, there is one advantage with optogenetic. There are many advantages of optogenetic. One of them is that you can redirect the light. You don't have to stick electrode here and there. You can move the light from this point to this point to that point and measure what happened. And I hope I'll show you some examples of that. So you turn on the light here. When you turn on the light all over the visual field, you turn on the light and you can see the oscillation before the light and the oscillation after the light, and by our measurement you do get this curve. That means that you have complete resetting. Complete resetting will turn on the light on the entire system. Now you go and turn on the light only in this corner of the visual system. And you do that, there's nothing. Although you have a response, there's no resetting. And the curve is what you expect when you don't have resetting. The interesting part, which we are still studying, is that when you turn on the light on this area, when you turn on the light on this area, in the first quarter of the cycle, you have a total resetting. But then when you go on, it suddenly jumps almost half a cycle and still stays stable. And then the rest of the thing is completely ineffective. And that means that not only with the it's possible that not only you can reset the time, but you can reset the time only when the input arrives at a certain phase of the oscillation of the clock. And this added another ability to our clock.
Have there been any behavioral tests for this kind of...
What?
Have there been any behavioral tests for this kind of experiment?
What do you call behavioral effect?
Well, we see that the cells are synchronizing in this frequency phase, but the behavior of this...
I will have something to say about that at the end, but as it goes, it doesn't seem that we are going to reach the end. I stop at 11:15. Good. Okay. Now, what about... What, the screen? I didn't mention. Most of this work, up to now, it's working on brain slices. In a brain slices, you look at the field through a microscope. This is about half of the size of the inferior olive nucleus at this resolution. So you look at a small part of the inferior olive.
Okay, and the gray one is like even smaller part? I mean, it's like you turn on the light on...
I turn on the light here, and I turn on the light here, or turn on the light all over here.
So why is the difference between the conditions, say that...
What's the difference between this and that? Is that what you ask? Why do I get this kind of response as opposed to this or that?
I just heard that you said that when the input arrives only in a certain phase of the neurons, then it restarts. But how does this...
You mean, I want to make clear, you ask what's so special of this thing here that make these properties? Partly due to the strength of the input, but it's not totally closed. I don't really know what's caused this thing. And I think this is a very interesting thing. But I don't know what caused it.
Activated, then you get the resetting of the clock.
What, say it again?
Only when enough input is arriving.
Enough input, yeah. Or it's contaminated by indirect input that is activated by the same fiber and going to another interneurons in the area and generate something else. So we want to start and stop the clock. Here to start and stop the clock, and it will take me back to a very old work by Linus in 1974, and he suggested that the neurons in the inferior olive are connected to each other via electrical synapse. Electrical synapse, it's specific channels that allow direct current flow from one cell to another. That's electrical synapse. They learn about electrical synapse. Nachon, Mati? You learned about electrical synapse? No. You never heard about Have you heard about synapses? What a shame. So electrical synapse is a very... it has this day more interest in electrical synapse, and its specific channel that connect two cells and allow direct current to pass from one cell to another. And today they claim that most of inhibitory interneurons in the cortex or in the cerebellum, most of them are interconnected through electrical synapse And that has some, or maybe important implication of how or what's the function of inhibitory circuit. Because if all inhibitory neurons are connected by electrical synapse, it means that these networks of inhibitory neurons tend to fire synchronously, because that's what electrical coupling allows. It makes accurate synchronized activity. So if you have two inputs to two neurons, two exciter inputs to two neurons, this will generate an action potential at this time. This is another time, and because they are coupled, they will both generate action potential exactly at the same time. The importance of this extreme accuracy of timing is not really clear. But this is electrical coupling. It's been studied over 100 years ago with invertebrate, and it always appears in systems that need synchronization. So they found out that within the inferior olive, the neurons, the different neurons are connected by gap junction. Gap junction is the name, the structural name for electrical synapse. And then he suggested that a gap junction between two neurons, current will flow from this neuron to the other neuron, and once this neuron is active, that will follow. But then you can activate inhibitory input at the location of the gap junction. Then you generate a shunt, and the current, instead of going from one cell to another, it will leak out. So functionally, by this inhibitory input, you can uncouple the cell. So cells are synchronized, and I'll hope to get to there. I'm not sure what's the mechanism to generate the rhythm that we are talking about. It's based on coupling between the neurons. All this idea, beautiful idea, was based on morphological studies, where they found out that this is the electron microscopy manifestation of gap junction of this one, of gap junction. So you see the membrane of this cell and the membrane of this cell get very close one to another, and then you have connection between them. And current can flow from this one to that one. They found this structure. The interesting part was that around this structure you have terminals of synaptic input, and they identify this terminal as inhibitory interneuron, inhibitory terminals. Now it took a lot about 15 years for Chris Dzeo, another person who studied cerebellum, to find out that the source of the inhibitory input, by marking this input cell, you look at the source of this inhibitory input. This is the gap junction, and this is the inhibitory input. He found out that the source of this inhibitory input is the deep cerebellar nuclei, the same neuron that I told you an hour ago. And that means that we can control the strength of the coupling by inhibitory input. And the source of the inhibitory input is the deep nuclei of the cerebellum, or the same cerebellar module I talked about. In this case, we don't have transgenic mice, so inject a virus into the deep cerebellar nuclei and see what happened in the inferior olive. And indeed, the deep nuclei are heavily labeled with heavily expression of channel rhodopsin. And when you go down to the inferior olive, you can see a lot of terminals. So this cerebellar module that I talked about, this cerebellar module sends the GABAergic input, the inhibitory neuron, from the deep nuclei going all the way down to the inferior olive to innervate the gap junction, the electrical synapse between the neuron. So we did the expression, we turn on the light, you do see inhibitory input as expected, and if you give several pulses of light, you can see almost a steady state of inhibitory condition in this cell. But the beautiful thing, and of course, when you measure coupling between cells, and how do you measure coupling between cells? You measure from two cells and you inject current in one cell, you get a response in the other cell, and vice versa, because it's direct current injection. So you inject current in cell number 1, you got this response, but you also get it in the cell number 2 because current is going through the gap junction. And if you go to cell number 2, you get something in cell number 1, and then you turn on the light and you activate the inhibition. And you can see the responses decrease both ways. And on a population level, you can get down to 50% reduction in the strength of the coupling between the cells. So we can modulate the coupling between inferior olive neuron. And now the big question, what does that do to oscillation? And when you do that, it's completely blocks the oscillatory activity of this neuron. So we can stop the clock, if you want. And you can start the clock. And we can reset the clock. And we can organize the system into a very clear clocks. So the ability to organize it in a different way depends, of course, on who you are stimulating and when. And this is one example of measuring from cell of the inferior olive and turn on the light all over, and then you block the oscillation. Now you can move, as I did before, turn on the light on this area, and it's not completely blocked. Then you move down here, and almost no effect. And then you move a little bit, completely blocked. And then you go outside of this area at all, and completely blocked. So it's not a special kind of spatial organization. It depends which neuron you activate by light, what area you remove, in which area you remove the electrical coupling between the neurons. That's what will determine the turn on, turn off of the clock. How do you generate a clock? That's a question that we are studying since the late 90s. How do you generate a clock? I mean the fact that in the body we have pacemaker, it's well known, you know. Our heart is keep ticking. The same, not the same, but pretty much the same for years. And the mechanism is not that much different. But we need some interaction between neurons. And if you want to make a reliable clock and that will be able to modulate the activity there, you have to have a special feature. The feature is that, and it's backed up by experimental observation, that each neuron by itself does not oscillate. Does not oscillate. A neuron by itself does not oscillate. Only when you generate a network of coupled neurons, they will start to oscillate. And that's what explained the previous results, that when you turn on, you reduce the coupling strength, you remove the oscillation. So how you can generate a system that a neuron by itself is not oscillating, only when a coupled, they oscillate. And then the cerebellum can decide which part of the olive will be coupled and decide when couple we're going to couple. This will generate oscillation, that will generate the input, and so on. And I hope to get to that at the end, but I doubt it. So we came out with the heterogeneity model, which means there is some degree of heterogeneity in the cellular properties of the olive neuron. So we build a model, a simple model of a neuron that have only a leak conductance, which is the leak of the membrane, or it can be a potassium conductance, it has better. You study modeling of neurons. That's not new. And only and have a calcium conductance of specific type. The calcium conductance of specific type, which follow the conductor follow this relationship, means that it's like the sodium current in action potential. It's have an activation and inactivation function. And with these two parameters, we try to build a network. And we found out that you can take the entire space or separate labeled by the calcium conductance on the x-axis and the leak conductance at the y-axis. And each neuron within this space will be subdivided into 4 groups, which means that all the neurons in this area with this value of leak and this value of calcium will be stable cells. Stable cells mean that they don't do anything by themselves. You inject current, they respond to the current. You stop the current, they stop to respond. Stable cells. All the cells that we have here in this area, it's we call them conditional bistable, and I will maybe able to go back to that. No, it doesn't matter. All this area here are conditional oscillators. That means that they don't oscillate by themselves, but if you hyperpolarize the cell membrane, they will start to oscillate. Hyperpolarize the cell. Yeah. And only this area, small area, the cell oscillating spontaneously with this concentration of leak and calcium. Only in this area they oscillate, and when you inject current, they stop to oscillate, because the oscillation is a function of the membrane, the concentration of channels, and the membrane potential. And then we did a long work for see if this is really what happened in the olive, and we reconstruct this division in the neuron of the olive using, have you heard about hybrid? Oh, you haven't heard about hybrid. I mean, I have a cell and I want to add some calcium channel. I cannot add calcium channel, but I can connect it to a computer. The computer calculates how this voltage will behave if there were a channel there. I generate a cell with additional, from behavioral point of view, and then generate a cell with additional channel. Or, alternatively, reduce the channel.
Both experiments with computer? I mean, both the biology and the computer?
All the experiment today goes with computer.
I mean, you add more things to the cells by
I calculate the amount of current that I have to inject into the cell in order to mimic the situation of more or less channel. So I take the input. Computer is very fast, going much faster than the membrane time constant. You calculate what it should be the current, and then you get something. Anyhow, by that we can play with this technique. We can play along this axes. And we found out that the red one are stable cells, the green one are oscillating cell, and so on and so forth. And the full circles here are the cells that we measure, and we go along this axis or this axis with this technique. Now, what do we get with that? Okay, a second. Take 6 cells randomly selected from the whole range, and you connect them with electrical coupling, like what we have in the olive. So you see the red one is within the oscillating range, and it oscillates. The blue one is chosen between the outside of this range, and it does not oscillate. Now you put electrical coupling between them, and the blue and the red are oscillating. Now you increase the coupling between them, and everything stops. And you further increase everything, and they start to oscillate again. So the strength of the oscillation will make the decision of if is it going to oscillate or not. And that can explain all the data that I have shown you before of how you reset the system and how you turn on the system and how you turn off the system. That's a modeling of which we call the heterogeneity model, which is based only on some degree of changes between cells. They are not exactly the same regarding the concentration or density of channel that we have. They all have the same channel, but they're not the same.
Can I ask about can you go back to the
Of course. Another one?
Yeah. Here, did you do anything that is related to electrophysiology, or is only in the computer? That's what I did. This is a model or an experiment?
Why? We generate a beautiful PhD program to merge model and experiment.
Okay.
This is it.
Okay, so can you explain again, because I'm not sure I understood how did you get this graph?
How did I get this graph?
Yeah, what was
The graph is a theoretical graph.
Yeah, but
This one is experimental graph.
and how did you
You measure many neurons.
Okay.
You measure many neurons, and you want to go into detail. You measure many neurons, and you pick up animals at a very young age. At a very young age, they don't have coupling. The coupling develops after the day 10 or something. So all these cells don't have coupling. So each cell is by itself. Now, you measure the cell, right, whether it's oscillate or not. And that's the source of the full symbols.
Of the young one?
Full symbols, everything. All those done in young. These are the full signals. So you have green and green and green and green and square. Now in which, wait, that's what you measure. You measure this thing and it oscillates, or you measure this red one and it did not oscillate.
What's the difference between the symbols?
Between?
Between the symbols. Triangle and the square.
The symbols are all the triangles supposed to be around here, and all the circles are going to be around here. But the full symbols are the actual measurement. Okay? And I can take this full circle, cell, and I can move it along the y-axis by the procedures that I described, or I can move it along the x-axis. And that's the point that you see here. And you can show that if you increase enough the calcium current, you will switch from quiescent cell into oscillating cell. So the idea is we got this possible distribution theoretically, and we reconstruct it experimentally, where part of the reconstruction is kind of interaction between computer and experiment. that okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
So make sure I understood. The MC ones are the actual measurements.
No, the
after-
field one are the actual measurements.
No, but the MC ones are the actual measurements after you influence the calcium.
No, no. The field circle, you got a cell, and that's what it's doing. It's quiescent here, and this cell oscillating without doing anything. And now I start to shift it along the axis.
But you shift the actual cell or in simulation? That's what I don't know.
I said again, this beautiful program says that simulation experiment is the same. So you take, how do you do this? It's a beautiful technique. You know how the current should have behaved if we have twice many channels, right? So the computer reads the voltage, calculate the amount of current that should have been generated if we have twice the number of channels. And he injects this current, and then you think that that's what would have been happened if that was the case, and then generate the response of the cell. You are with me? So it's a mixture. You tell the computer what's the model, and the computer measures the voltage. I don't like it. Well, the computer doesn't measure anything. We measure the voltage, we give it to the computer, and he calculates what would have happened if we have twice the number of channels. And he injects the current. And then we get a response of what would have happened. And he do it in a very high speed of 20 kilohertz. So he can much faster than voltage change. So you can really calculate what happened.
And then you draw these lines according to what you...
No, you draw the line according to the theoretical. We can just expand the axis here, and that's what we measure actually. Top? Mati, what should I do?
I think you have to stop.
Huh?
I think you have to stop.
Thank you.
So we can, yeah, let's stop.